these are not necessarily, environmentalists and hippies, just kind of making businesses as utopian as possible. They're savvy business people who realize that if you have, environmental regulations internally in place, you're going to avoid lawsuits. If you have a diverse workforce, you're going to be more creative and you're going to be buffeted against, potentially other lawsuits and boycotts in the future.
We've invested in close to 50% of gender diverse investments, which means that they either have a female founder or a majority or close to 50% of the executive team are gender diverse. And we see this actually performing more than the usual male founders in itself.
Hello and welcome to Connected. I'm Tomasz Koper, sitting in for Divya Gopalan. In 2016, some of the richest men in the world, among them Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, Richard Branson, and Jack Ma, poured $1 billion into the Breakthrough Energy Ventures Fund. Its goal was to build companies able to deliver the next generation of reliable, affordable, and emissions-free energy to the world. But business heavyweights seem to be in a different place in 2025, with many companies de-emphasizing their environmental efforts, perhaps to better align with the changing priorities of new governments in the United States and elsewhere in the world. Drill, baby, drill, to quote US President Donald Trump. That's why today we want to look at how business and environmental goals intersect through the lens of ESG, or responsible investing, which puts environmental, social, and governance issues at its core. For this discussion, we are joined from Manila by Carlo Chen-Delantar, partner and the head of ESG and circular economy at Gobi Partners. And from Taipei, we have our contributor and an environmental consultant, Nate Maynard. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Nate, I want to start with you. For the uninitiated, what does ESG, so environmental, social, governance, mean in practice?
Thanks, Tomas. Well, it means many things in practice. At a base level, it's a series of frameworks and questions that companies answer through a non-financial accounting framework. The two main ones are GRI and SASB. And companies respond to these questions and they might be like, do you have a carbon target? Do you have a recycling program? Describe it. And then it might ask questions in a social level. Do you have gender balance in the boardroom? Do you have inclusive practices to help disabled customers access your products? Do you have safeguards in place to help those employees who might have certain disabilities work at the same level as others? And then there's governance questions. Are there anti-corruption measures in place? Do you have measures in place to ensure that, not everyone in the family is in the business at the same time and there's no safeguards there? So these are questions that companies answer. They're not necessarily requirements. And at the end, when you fill these out, there's other third parties that give you ESG ratings. And so, if you have a carbon target and you have gender balance in the boardroom and you work towards that, you might have a particularly high score. But it is a bit subjective and it can change from region to region and company to company.
Well, subjective, I think we'll zero in on that a little later in the program. But Carlo, I want to go to you. You're an investor. So I want to ask you, does ESG actually matter to the company's bottom line?
So yes, it matters, especially as us investors in this part of the world. So we're Asia focused. We have a policy making sure that we look into ESG mandates. And so far we have about 400 startups now. A lot of them are going through their ESG journey. And what we want to create, especially in the private markets, is to be a beacon and pioneer leading the charge on what ESG means for preparing companies at an early stage move towards becoming ESG compliant. Sooner or later, it's going to be regulated in Asia. And hopefully before they even go public, they're already ESG practicing and it becomes synonymous with what startups and innovation is, being a responsible, ethical, invested company by Gobi Partners.
Well, that sounds great, but I want to focus on the E part of this equation. So environment. Nate, how green are ESG investments really? Do we know that they're having a positive impact on the ground?
Sure, it really depends on where you are. I mean, a lot of ESG is around the environment. A huge reason that Taiwanese corporates, for example, participate in ESG funds or want to become listed on an ESG index is because they're setting carbon targets, they're buying renewable energy, and maybe they're forced to do this. Maybe their customers have requirements for them to set up a carbon target, or maybe they think that they can get kind of a better stock price by doing that. So ESG doesn't require them to do this, but it rewards them for doing, let's say, good behaviors. In Taiwan, the price of electricity is pretty low. There's not really a good economic reason, especially 4 or 5 years ago, to buy renewable energy. So these ESG frameworks rewarded companies who did the so-called right thing by buying renewable energy. And I'd want to ask Carlo too, what are you seeing in Southeast Asia in terms of companies doing the environmental aspect of ESG? Is that prominent, or are there more like social and governance issues that come to the front?
So since we've been creating our report the past few years, we've started our process of an ESG audit and reporting every single year. One of the key things we've seen, and congruent to what you were saying, Nate, is although environment is as a key aspect of larger companies, we see governance and social being the starting point. They do really well on that point because local labor laws, of course, policies for within the workplace and employees. Environment is pretty low, mainly for the reason why technology doesn't directly go straight to environment, or at least a lot of our startups see that as like a second priority. So now we're looking at what does this mean long term, right? Although tech is fairly important to consider, we're seeing that going towards what you're saying is how do we bridge that gap and making sure that that environmental aspect is tackled early on. So we see this as an important part, and of course, at an early stage, we mandate our companies to focus on the ESG data convergence initiative as mandatory, and as they grow, we see them starting to work on their SASB requirements as well. So things are changing. Of course, it's an uphill climb, but I think especially in Asia, we're seeing us leading in this space, especially on the Western part of the world. It's being challenged, and that's something for us is really an opportunity.
Before we go further, I do want to give our viewers a little context and take a look at the distribution of ESG investments between sectors of the economy and in countries in the region. According to the US finance company Morgan Stanley Capital International, most ESG investments can be found in IT, finances, and non-essential or consumer discretionary goods and services. When broken down by country, ESG investments are most often seen in Japan with close to 33%, then in almost equal parts in China and Taiwan, both between 18 and 19%, followed by India and Australia. So, Carlo, looking at this breakdown, what trends are you seeing in the region, in the ASEAN region?
On the technology side, it's still going to move upwards. There are challenges right now with DEI. We're going to this conversation of a recollection and reflection of what DEI means. Is it a change of terms? Even ESG as a buzzword in itself arguably could be changed. For us in Gobi, we call it responsible investing, right? Can we find and allocate capital to companies that will last long and to the benefit of our society and also neighboring economies? Put it simply, we want to make sure our capital is put to good use. So I think that's a crucial part we're seeing, and it makes sense that Japan and China are leading the pack in this space because government is really mandating companies to do the right thing. It'll take a while, but the fact that the movement is fast is mainly because policy implementation and enforcement go hand in hand, rather than you have a policy announced and then it'll take years for enforcement.
Well, speaking of companies that last for a long time, in Taiwan we have titans of the tech industry, TSMC, similar companies. We see a lot of technology in those charts that break it down by sector. Now, these types of businesses tend to be very energy intensive and very water intensive, especially in Taiwan when it comes to chip manufacturing. So Nate, how are these companies reconciling their ESG goals with their massive needs for water and energy?
In some cases, they aren't. In some cases, they are. If you look at a company like Formosa Plastics, they have a really high ESG rating in Taiwan. Now, they also have a number of environmental lawsuits around the world and have some serious environmental justice issues. That means their environmental pollution on kind of poorer or lower income communities. Now, others, TSMC, I think it's worth mentioning, they committed to using 100% renewable electricity at a time when Taiwan really didn't have those resources available. And because TSMC is such a huge electricity user in Taiwan, it really forced a lot of renewable energy developers to initiate projects that they probably wouldn't do so normally. So ESG, like Carlo said, is kind of like a risk management. Initially it started out as the principles for responsible investment. These are not necessarily, environmentalists and hippies, just kind of making businesses as utopian as possible. They're savvy business people who realize that if you have, environmental regulations internally in place, you're going to avoid lawsuits. If you have a diverse workforce, you're going to be more creative and you're going to be buffeted against, potentially other lawsuits and boycotts in the future. So these are guidelines. They leave a lot of room open and they can be exploited by greenwashing. At the same time, they also give third parties an opportunity to look at these companies and say, hey, you're lying, or hey, you missed your carbon target, or your carbon target's ridiculous. Why is it set to 2050 when you're a small professional services company? So it's really a mixed bag, and it's up to consumers and investors and regulators to use this information to make positive change.
Well, you mentioned greenwashing there. Like, how does that look in practice? What do companies do that can be classified as greenwashing?
Yeah, there's a lot of different examples. I think that, in the carbon space, the easiest one is to set a carbon target really far in the future. Because if you set your carbon target for 2050, you say you're going to have net zero carbon emissions, people kind of just believe you and take that at face value. But what we really need to see is action year on year. If you commit to something like a science-based carbon target, you need to have a 4.2% reduction in your carbon emissions every year. Many major companies in Taiwan and abroad don't achieve that. And if you look at Microsoft, which is not only committed to net zero carbon emissions, they want to be fully carbon positive and undo all their historical carbon emissions. They are not on track to do that because of their increasing electricity use from AI. So that's one good example of greenwashing, and then there's the classics, maybe it's a plastics company that organizes beach cleanups. Maybe it's a company that says, oh yeah, well, we're using recycled materials in our products, but they're really only 1 or 2%. So you don't want to judge every company just because they're trying to do something environmental and say, oh, that's fake, that's greenwashing. You want to look at their intentions over time and judge their maturity through that. And then you can have a clearer picture on whether or not they're greenwashing. And sometimes it's counterintuitive, I wouldn't say TSMC is an environmental company, but they are being responsible given, their kind of market monopoly and their force available.
Well, Carlo, I want to stay with the E part of ESG for a while longer. You invest in circular economy companies. Are you seeing a slowdown in this activity following the U.S. withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, since those kind of commitments normally drive a lot of ESG activity?
So key facts here. Around 20% of all our investments for 2023 were in startups that have circular economy principles. We've invested in over 62 companies that have circular economy principles. Although we've created this whole database and thesis of being circular economy as an investment team for Gobi Partners in this region. We see it going up and up, and for the reasons I can lay out to you right now. Most investments the past 3 years came from specific industries outside of AI, are battery storage, mobility, renewable energy, and of course, circular marketplaces. So we see this changing. However, we see that circular economy will be a top investment theme in the next couple of years. And it's pretty simple, right? Efficiency, waste, anything that involves these two things will have an opportunity, especially the need and lack of resources in the world. Circular economy is really the future, and we see that as a next frontier in this space.
Well, it seems that Asia, our region, is well positioned to keep driving those types of economic activity. But is there an opportunity to also take leadership, since we're seeing countries that traditionally drive these kind of movements pulling out in recent months and years?
I love this question because it's a question where we've always been overshadowed on what's happening, and the Western part of the world has dictated and led what it meant to be ESG compliant. So at this point of time, it's really an opportunity to stand out and continue build the bridging towards what we call an ESG universality in this space. So yes, this is definitely an opportunity in the next 3-4 years. China has done a great job. I think Taiwan is definitely the circular economy hotspot of Asia Pacific. We also see ASEAN showcasing a really, really bright spot on what consumerism looks like in this space. EVs and renewable energy, nobody thought it would beat analyst expectations the past 10 years, and the adoption rate is beyond everyone could imagine. Just the cost in itself on solar power has changed drastically, but really the next question is, the frontier of power generation, battery storage. We're seeing that change the dynamics of ride-hailing, logistics, even at the point of finance, right? The semiconductors is going to be the next thing as well. So now we're seeing investments, not just thinking about circular economy, but how it fits with what you're hearing most often now, what we call the intelligent age, how AI is heralding the changes with the dynamics of economies, businesses, and even society.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because Taiwan is often called Technology Island, and it is expanding into AI, deeper into the IT fields. And although Taiwan is not a signatory of the Paris Agreement, it often follows UN guidelines on these kind of things. But with a looming energy crunch, since Taiwan has been struggling with supplying enough electricity for its industries, are investors in Taiwan still on track? Are they still committed to these kind of goals? Or are they maybe being a bit more cautious given the energy situation on the ground? Nate?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of both. I mean, I think Taiwanese investors are always pretty cautious, and I think globally there is a bit of pause at the moment. But at the same time, a lot of Taiwanese companies sell to Europe, which makes up, 80% of ESG investment. They're selling to Europe, which is going to have, by the way, a tariff on goods based on their carbon emissions. So if Taiwan wants to be able to continue to sell globally, and whether that's to, India or ASEAN as well, and Europe, why not just use the most renewable energy available? And then, by the way, in 4 years, it's very possible that the U.S. might switch back to a different administration that is going to care about the science. And that isn't going to change. Climate change is not getting better. It's only going to get worse. Public awareness is continuing to grow, even in the U.S., where we're seeing a pullback on these ESG and DEI initiatives. Somewhere between 60 and 70% of the population views climate change threats as very serious and is willing to change their habits to prevent it. So Taiwan, I think that they're going to continue to see this opportunity and be a savvy manufacturer and supply what's being demanded. And that might mean partnerships with ASEAN. I know that, the electric vehicle company Gogoro has kind of expanded into India and other countries in the region. And I think they're going to continue doing that. And unfortunately, it might just mean that countries stop listening to the U.S. The U.S. has pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement, but Saudi Arabia and Russia are still in it. So just because the U.S. left doesn't mean that these other countries aren't going to continue negotiating this. And it might be that some point in the future, countries agree to limit imports from the U.S. because of the carbon intensity increasing of those products.
Well, Carlo, Nate mentioned DEI, which connects pretty closely with the S part of ESG, the social issues, the social aspects of running a business. How are companies in the region approaching the other two letters of ESG, the social and the governance issues?
So going back, when you look at the social side of investments that we've done, and it's a good indicator of what's happening for new startups that are growing really, really fast. Social aspect, we've invested in close to 50% of gender diverse in investments, which means that they either have a female founder or a majority, or close to 50% of the executive team are gender diverse. And we see this actually performing more than the usual male counterpart founders in itself. Of course, it's not just that. We also need to look into what these startups and innovators are providing to society, right? So great workplaces, better benefits, and so forth. The social aspect is the heart of what beats the collaborative environment for any types of startups in this space. Now, governance is really the bedrock. Without governance, nothing will be implemented in force. And we see this as an important aspect. And by flying colors, most, if not all of our startups, and even startups now, you would never invest in a startup if they don't have sound governance practices, local labor laws, making sure that they pay taxes on time, SEC certifications. These are just important essentials. And if you don't have this, ring, 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 alarms will be ringing, and that's where you have cautionary tales of ESG. So S and G are the first stepping stones and steps for startups to actually fulfill the last part, which is the environmental side. And that's perfect in terms of just the narrative of E becoming the most important aspect to complete the ESG narrative for any companies that want to go public or want to become decade-long innovators and contributors to society and the economy.
So you're not worried that if the U.S. is pulling back from its social practices and social policies that were more aligned with what they call DEI, is that not going to influence business people and investors here in Asia, sort of in a way? Oh, if even the U.S. is pulling back, if even the U.S. doesn't care about that anymore, why should we?
I've had these conversations with peers and just in general, right? Like how the U.S. impacts everything globally, more so in Asia, is tantamount of the amount of influence and power it provides. But let's look at the silver lining here. The silver lining here is that, historically speaking, the term prohibition actually creates a level of taking a step back, reevaluating on what works and what doesn't, and coming out strong. Anything that was prohibited before, and we know that shouldn't be prohibited, long-term, people will speak up. Demand will rise, supply will follow. And I guess, although prohibition sounds on the negative connotation right now, prohibition actually creates new environments, new processes, and new innovations that work for the needs of the world. The data shows demand is there. Gen Zs, millennials, even Gen Alphas are going to talk about why aren't we creating companies that actually matter. And this is why we exist. We look for these companies, and sooner or later it'll just come. And as we all know, history will be on our side. And I think that's what matters the most.
I have to say, I like the picture that you're painting. And before we end today, Nate, I want to ask you, how do you see companies in Asia, in Taiwan, and in the region charting their path forward in this new world that we're seeing, where big players, or some of them at least, are scaling back their ESG efforts, are pulling back from environmental commitments?
I'm seeing a couple different paths, but the hopeful path that I'd like to talk about is one where companies in Asia can chart their own course. The US used to be the richest and most influential country in the world. That may not be the case any longer. And as Carlo said, there's a lot of creative and interesting companies and founders that want to create a better world. There's always going to be that market demand. It's not going away. The science of climate and environmental destruction is real. It's there. We know it. The benefits of having an inclusive, socially balanced company is there, and the strengths of good governance are obviously well known. So companies are going to continue choosing that path because it is the profitable one to do, and they will find that there are customers there for them. The companies that abandon ESG will find out that there was a reason that all of these box-ticking exercises were in place, because you expose yourself to boycotts, you expose yourself to lawsuits, you risk losing access to certain markets, and you harm your credibility. There's a pretty famous electric vehicle company in the United States. Its CEO is now a special government employee in the US, and they have a lot of lawsuits against them for racist practices. They have a very low ESG score, and as we speak, there are other electric vehicle companies around the world that are beating them. So I'm not saying that's necessarily related, but what we do see is strong stock performance of companies that stick to and adhere to ESG. So my hope for the future is that these companies continue on this path, and that Asia charts its own course, and that hopefully those in the West who don't think that ESG is the way will kind of come to their senses in 4 years or so.
Well, I couldn't hope for a better future, a better tomorrow, as you put it. Unfortunately, we ran out of time for this discussion today. Thank you very much again, Carlo Chen-Delantar, the head of ESG and circular economy at Gobi Partners, speaking to us from Manila, and from Taipei, connected contributor and an environmental consultant, Maynard. And for our viewers everywhere, it's been good to have your company. If you've enjoyed today's episode or have anything you would like to add to the dialogue, join the conversation on our social media. And remember, stay informed, stay engaged, and stay connected.